Study Session 6. Policy. Introduction. In Study Session 5, we discuss the features or standards that are obtainable in any formal organization. In this study session, we shall explore the concept of policy, the features and types of policy, and the basic determinants of government policy. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to describe the types of public policy, highlight the stages involved in policy formulation, describe the problems of policy implementation, and explain policy feedback and evaluation. Meaning of policy. Policy generally is a concept about which there is no agreement as to its meaning. Most scholars that have described policy described it as something that is more complex or more intricate than decisions itself. It is often difficult to determine whether any decision is a policy. But what is certain is that it is not all decisions that are policies. They may interpret or have the effect of various policies, but may not constitute the basic features of policy. Policy has been described in various ways. For instance, it has been described as a long series of more or less related activities and their effects. It is also described as a conscious decision or deliberate decision and the course that it takes as a result of interrelations among decisions. Tip. Policy has also been described as a purposive course of action followed by the government. In this case, we talk about health policy, educational policy, agricultural policy, etc. In this sense, it is whatever the government chooses to do or chooses not to do, action and inaction, intended and unintended actions. Features of a policy. A policy is said to possess the following attributes. 1. The decision which translates to policy should always be goal-oriented. What this means is that policy must be targeted at solving certain problems. A policy cannot be said to be a policy if it does not address certain issues related to the organization's goals. 2. A policy must connote some cause or pattern of action. That means that a policy should have an identifiable action plan that needs to be followed in order to meet up with the required goals of the organization. 3. A policy must also involve some overt action to solve a particular problem, many of which may also involve deliberate action in solving a particular problem. That means a policy may include action and inaction. 4. A policy must be based on constituted rules or laws. This makes a policy to be authoritative to promote certain values or agenda or allocate resources to promote the values of the organization. Reflection. A policy must connote some cause or plan of action. That means that a policy should have an identifiable action plan that needs to be followed in order to meet up with the required goals of the organization. Types of public policy. Types of public policy include the following: distributive policy, redistributive policy, regulatory policy, constituent policy. Distributive policy. This is a policy that is designed to create an equal access to the available resources by the people. Example: fuel subsidies, direct grants to agencies or individuals for certain goods and services, or for research purposes. It might even be for the purpose of promoting certain social services like free education. This type of policy does not encourage discrimination. Everybody seems to be better off. Redistributive policy. This policy involves the transfer of resources from one segment of the society to another in order to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor and to maintain equilibrium in the society. E.g., value added tax, VAT. Ironically, despite the effort of the government to bridge the gap, no society has maintained the equilibrium or bridged the gap between the rich and the poor. Regulatory policy. This is the type that is aimed at setting some standards or preventing negative activities in the society. This policy is to preserve the national value. For example, the establishment of NAFDAC by the government in Nigeria has been to guard against substandard and fake consumable goods. We also have the NBC, that is the National Broadcasting Commission, that prevents provocative films from being released into circulation. The Code of Conduct Bureau has also been established by the government to ensure the compliance of public servants to the rules of service. Regulatory policy, however, has two major forms. Competitive regulatory policy. This is a deliberate action on the part of government to limit the numbers of people participating in a particular activity or in producing certain goods and services. Protective regulatory policy. This is what the government uses to guide the activities of actors in order to prevent harmful or negative actions. This may require the government to apply some measure of force to prohibit certain negative actions in the society, e.g., armed robbery. Constitutive policy. This is a policy that cannot be placed on any of all those other types of policies earlier mentioned. This is the policy designed to meet the operational and security needs of the government, e.g., recruitment policy, minting policy, etc. Determinants of government policy choices. This is to highlight those factors that determine the choice of government policy implementation. They include the following. 1. The goals and the resources available to government. 2. The political and economic environment of the government. Policy formulation. Steps in policy formulation. Policy formulation is very important. This is because it is at this level that different things are put into consideration before arriving at a pattern of action to be taken for the smooth running of an organization. For instance, if the government wants to formulate a policy, it considers the goals and resources at its disposal. The problem government is targeting is equally put into consideration, likewise the population involved. Policies are not just formulated or arrived at without any purpose. Their purposes are to address certain problems or to achieve set goals. What needs to be done at this formulation stage therefore includes the following. 1. Identification of problems. 2. Setting of goals. 3. Determination of the objectives. 4. Selection of the best way among the variables that are available. 5. Estimating the cost of the alternatives through the use of cost-benefit analysis. 6. Identification of best alternative process if possible. When all these are attained, then there will be policy output. Policy output. Policy output comes in form of A. Laws, B. Policy statements, C. Directives, D. Guidelines. It should be noted that policy formulation is usually preceded by what is called policy agenda. This is the setting up of all the problems that need to be solved and then prioritize the ones that are urgent. This is because all the problems cannot be solved at the same time. Tip: policies are not just formulated or arrived at without any purpose. Their purposes are to address certain problems and to achieve set goals. Problems of policy formulation. 1. Frequent changes of government lead to frequent changes in policy. This phenomenon equally encourages wastages of national resources, as the new government may not be interested in the old policy. 2. Lack of adequate information and reliable data. 3. Difficulty in selecting national interest. In a heterogeneous society like Nigeria, for instance, it will be an uphill task for government to satisfy every interest group in the country through its policy formulation. 4. Poor communication among government units and departments. 5. Time constraints. For the fact that bureaucrats have specified time limits for prompt decisions to be taken, the luxury of time to explore every avenue for resources and information is lacking. 6. Problems associated with external pressure or forces are equally prominent in policy formulation. For example, in many developing countries, economic policies are often tied to the IMF and other external donors' conditionality. Policy implementation. When policies are formulated, they are meant to be implemented or put into practice, especially after the policies have been transformed into laws and guidelines. The actions and interactions that take place in order to attain the set goals is called policy implementation. It is therefore the activities directed at putting programs into effect. It is the heart of the policy process. Tip: the actions and interactions that take place in order to attain the set goals is called policy implementation. The features of or activities in policy implementation. Policy implementation involves three sets of activities. Interpretation. This involves giving meaning to an idea, which is translating and reducing the issues to an acceptable and visible direction. Organization. This means the establishment of systems and methods of putting a program into effect. Application. This is the routine provision of services, payments, benefits, and other objectives of the program to the beneficiary. Interpretation and organization are the instruments of the application because people are expected to see the result of the program interpreted and organized. The following factors must be considered when talking about policy implementation. 1. The policy must be implementable. This means that it must follow certain pattern of action and it must not be ambiguous. 2. The target population must be identifiable. 3. The agencies that will implement the policy must be identified. This is to discourage conflicting interests or functions among government agencies. 4. The resources that are needed for the policy formulation must be identified. And 5. The resources for the policy formulation should be systematically mobilized. Problems confronted in policy implementation. Note: many of the policies formulated by politicians often suffer when it gets to the implementation stage. This is not because the bureaucrats are unwilling to perform. It is because there is lack of political will to implement the policies on the part of the politicians. The environment itself is saturated with corruption, which is one big societal ill. 1. Many policies can only be implemented by many agencies, so there is an improper multiplicity of the agencies involved in policy implementation, which therefore results in lack of communication and coordination. 2. Policy implementation suffers because of the existence of clash of interests among government agencies. For example, the existence of both the Nigerian Police Force and Civil Defense Corps creates the problem of clash of interests. 3. The goals and objectives that are associated with government policies are often ambiguous, and this creates problems for policy implementation. 4. There is lack of monitoring and supervision of government policies. This hinders policy implementation. 5. An economy that is badly managed can also contribute to the problem of policy implementation. The inability to mobilize required resources in a bad economy can lead to the problem of policy implementation. And 6. Harsh political environment often creates problems for policy implementation. It has been noted that many of the policies formulated by politicians often suffer when it gets to the implementation stage. This is not because the bureaucrats are unwilling to perform. It is because there is lack of political will to implement the policies on the part of the politicians. The environment itself is saturated with corruption, which is one big societal ill. All these create problems for policy implementation. Policy feedback and evaluation. Feedback takes the form of information generated from the effects of policy. The information goes back to the system. It is recycled and used to provide better policies. It is equally through the impact of the policies implemented that evaluation is made. Evaluation of policy, therefore, means the assessment of the policy actions to check whether the policy actually achieved the desired goals. In essence, feedback is important, for it helps in re-examining the effect of the work done. It is through this process that the defects noted are corrected for better policy formulation in future. Techniques of evaluation. A. Techniques that measure the relationship between cost, the benefit, and the utility of policy, that is, cost-benefit analysis. B. Techniques that measure output or performance. And C. Techniques that use experiments to evaluate policy in a program. That is done while the program is ongoing. The reasons for techniques in policy evaluation are the following. 1. It increases accountability. 2. It provides the basis for policy planning and control. 3. It provides information for post-implementation. 4. It helps in strategic management. And 5. It provides basis for staff appraisal. Note: Evaluation of policy means the assessment of the policy actions to check whether the policy actually achieved the desired goals. In essence, feedback is important, for it helps in re-examining the effect of work done. It is through this process that the defects noted are corrected for better policy formulation in future. Problems of policy feedback and evaluation. 1. Given the environment we find ourselves, there is lack of techniques, facilities to assess policy implementation. Fortunately, the federal government has strengthened a number of institutions whose duties are to assess government policies and submit their findings to the appropriate quarters. An example is Nigeria Institute for Social and Economic Research, NISA. 2. Lack of adequate information and data also constitutes problem for policy feedback and evaluation. This problem often creates policy misjudgment. And 3. Caged press. In many developing countries, journalists are often denied freedom. The press, which is considered as the fourth estate of the realm, would have been very effective if only the government had given journalists free access to information and data. This would have made information available for policy feedback and evaluation. Study session summary. In this study session, we examined the concept of policy. Even though there is no agreeable definition of the term policy, the term consists of a set of interrelated decisions or actions taken to achieve organizational goals and aspirations. We noted further that the policy circle entails policy formulation, implementation, feedback and evaluation, which are the processes involved in the making of policy. End of study session 6. Thanks.